Good evening. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral. It's such a blessing to see all of you here tonight. We have a wonderful program planned for this evening, and I'm glad that you're all here. We are so blessed to have Lee Mingwei as our artist in residence this year. Mingwei creates participatory works infused with beauty and ritual, where strangers can explore issues of trust, intimacy, and self-awareness. His work has been shown around the world, including in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, Centre Pompidou in Paris, and Tate Modern in London. On Saturday, we will be offering his work, Our Labyrinth for Grace, in which 3 dancers will alternate sweeping rice into labyrinthine patterns. It's difficult to describe, but beautiful to experience. I experienced the Tate Modern version of it. It was fantastic. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all on Saturday. The performance on Saturday begins at noon and continues until midnight, and please do come to see it for yourself. Tonight, Mingwei will be in conversation with Claudia Schmuckli, a Curator-in-Charge of Contemporary Art and Programming for the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco. She joined the museums in 2016, where she develops exhibitions and commissions and acquires new works for their collection. In the spring of 2024, the De Young is presenting a retrospective of Mingwei's work. Thank you for being here tonight, and please join me in welcoming Lee Mingwei and Claudia Schmuckli.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. As Malcolm said, I have the great honor of working with Mingwei on a survey of his work, which we will unveil in the spring of 24, but it's been really wonderful to be able to spend more time and have him here in San Francisco, premiering a variation of a work, yes, I shall say, that we will not be showing. So it's a really nice complementary gesture and sort of leading up to the survey. I wanted to begin the conversation with a question about concepts of generosity, because one of the things that really drew me and still draws me to your work is a spirit of generosity that really pervades and I think is the connecting thread between all of your projects. And yet how that generosity is articulated differs, yes, sort of from project to project. Yeah. And what I was hoping to do tonight is maybe tease out sort of like these differences and talk about different concepts of generosity, not just the idea of the gift, which is something that you talk about a lot and how your work is being talked about a lot, but delve a little deeper into what we actually mean by the gift, what are the philosophical and, cultural traditions that you draw on when you think about a project, and how gifting or this idea is articulated through different iterations of your work. So maybe that's a good place to start.
Sure, yes. Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here. I remember when I was in high school, I went to Woodside Priory in the South Bay, and the priest will usually take us, the boys, to come here to gawk at the Christmas decoration. And now I'm almost 60. It's really quite an honor to be back here as an artist in residence and to be able to share some of my work with the community. So speaking of gift and hospitality, I remember when I was at California College of Art and Craft. At that time, it was called CCAC. In the textile department. The professors highly encouraged us to read a book by Louis Hyde called The Gift. And that book talked about particularly about the role of an artist in the society. What is our role? Our role is the gift receiver and the giver to the community. And once we receive the gift, it's not for us to keep. We need to share the gift with the community. So that was hugely inspiring for me. I remember growing up in Taiwan, my grandmother, who was a doctor, after she retired, the first thing she does in the morning is to make this big pot of rice porridge. Bring out to the yard, open the door, and anyone can come and have a bowl of porridge. It's just something that she does in the morning. And that really embedded within me the idea of sharing things with community and not asking things back as exchange. So I think that really was the seed of who I became now as an artist. And I'm lucky enough to be able to create some of the works that deals with or embedded with the idea of gift giving and sharing within the community.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about maybe one of your earliest projects in this context, which I believe you did while you were still in graduate school.
Yeah,
in
the dining
Yale.
project, exactly, yes.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about the dining project? Because I think it's really an
yes.
important piece in your whole
Thank you, Claudia. Yes. So that also had to do with the idea that my grandmother cooked for all the strangers, right? When I graduated from CCAC, I worked in a textile firm for 2 years and really didn't like it. So I applied for graduate school, and I luckily got into Yale in the sculpture program. So when I moved to New Haven, I did not know anybody. I just thought, I felt very alienated. So what I did was I put posters around campus asking people who are interested in food sharing and intimate conversation to contact me. At that time, we didn't have email or anything, right? So I had this poster with a little slip at the end. At the end of the day, I had 45 messages in my machine. People were very curious. So I called them back and just say, if you're hungry and you wanted to have a free meal, please come at 7 o'clock and I will just prepare a meal just for you. You don't need to do anything except just enjoy the meal with me. So this is quite different from probably other type of what we understand as performative work, because there is absolutely no recording of this particular event between myself and the stranger. So it's about the intimacy between these two people. So I did that whole thing for a whole year when I was at graduate school. And it's a way of feeding myself, but also to do a project in the same time.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about sort of the risk that you're taking and the sort of risk that your guest is taking, especially responding to an invitation from somebody completely unknown.
Yes.
And so maybe it's also helpful to think about the fact that hospitality and hostility actually share a common semantic root.
Yes.
And so they're very, very closely related. And if you enter a circumstance like that, you never know quite how it will turn out, right? Can you give maybe some examples of interactions that you've had and the different tenor of what happened?
Yes. So it's a very fine line between hospitality and hostility, right? The first night when I did it, I was so nervous. I kept imagining who this person might be. I spoke to this person over the phone for 5 minutes, and I conjured up this person. And when this person came, he was completely different than what I imagined. And I told myself, take a deep breath, relax, and just give up anything that you imagine this person is supposed to be, and enjoy the meal. In fact, he became my dearest friend, Hubertus, who lives in Munich. So I realized the way to continue this type of work is to be as open as a baby, to be as naive as a baby. Because when the stranger who we eventually come to this kind of realm that I have staged, if he or she senses that this person, myself, is very vulnerable and open, then the nature of this person, the response is to protect me and not to harm me. On the other hand, if I gear it up with kind of like, this sort of, oh, you might harm me, you might hurt me, then the response will be very different. So it's kind of a reverse psychology. You need to be so vulnerable and so open in order to be protected in this situation. And that really sets the tone of all my projects, because there's always a tension to the work. The tension is this unknown, that we don't know if this person's going to receive the song or not, or if the person will, do something. My experience of this kind of for about 25 years, it always has been extremely rewarding. I don't think I ever had a single experience that made me feel so awful that I don't want to do this anymore. It's always been wonderful.
And let me ask you, because you started the dining project, I think at your home, right?
No, it was at the studio.
Oh,
and
you did it in the studio.
Yeah, and that was a very, very obvious decision for me, because if I cook the meal at home and invite the person to my home, it becomes an unequal territory. It's not it's not a mutual space,
of course. Yeah.
However, if it's in the studio, in the school, then it's still my territory, but it tends to be a little bit more open. And I purposely left the door open. And 7 o'clock at Yale, no one's really at the studio. They're all like partying or doing something else. So I would be, with this person having a meal, lovely, quiet meal. And these people will actually come multiple times. So for the whole year, every week I probably will cook 3 to 4 meals for different people. And Hubertus kept coming every week. So that's what I did the whole year at Yale.
And how did it change, if at all? Maybe it didn't. Once you translated this concept into a museum setting.
Exactly, yeah. So my very first show, a museum show, was at the Whitney, 1998. And it was slightly different. Instead of putting posters in New York City, we set up a small box for lottery. So you could put your name and circle the date that you are available to come at 7 o'clock in the evening and then I select people that way. And I usually select the person 7 days before their actual dining and say, hi, you have won the Whitney Lottery of Dining Project. So, and I would usually start cooking, because I would call up the person and say, please let me know your dietary preference. So it's not about, oh, do you want a French cuisine or Asian cuisine, but it's more about what you don't like to eat, so I don't cook something that will make you ill. And then just went to Chinatown, get usually simple Asian stir-fry and vegetable and miso soup. Came back to the to the Whitney 4th floor to prepare the meal. And fairly quickly, I realized I'm actually not preparing the meal for 2 people, myself and the person, because the curators and the guard kept coming to the kitchen and say, wow, that smells really good. So I would prepare a meal for 10 people. And so it became quite a fun experience, because the guards will start coming in and share the meal with me before the actual performance began.
Yeah.
So it was a whole evening of internal activity. And I was very lucky that when I was doing this project at Yale, my professor, Ronnie Horn, at the time, told me, do you know Rick Teravaya's work? So Rick did this, one of the most iconic work, which is he cooked curry at Gavin Brown, right? In Soho,
New York,
in New York.
Yeah,
So
late 90s.
93, 94?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
I think so, yeah.
And he just cooked this big pot of curry, left it at the table, and then anybody can come and eat. But he wasn't there to serve you the meal. He just disappeared. So Ronnie asked me, you really should have a conversation with Rick because people are going to talk about this work with that work because both of you are using food as a medium for relationship. So Rick came and taught me for a whole semester, and we had a really beautiful conversation at the end of 1 year, 1 hour of discussion. So we both agree that both of our projects are about intimacy, hospitality, and sharing of resources, right?
And yet, the types of relationship that you establish with the audience, I would argue, are radically different.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he said, you know, Mingwei, me as an artist in this project, I play a very introverted work, whereas you play an extroverted role. And I said, why is that? He said, because after I cook, I disappear. I don't talk to people.
Yeah.
In this work, you cook and you are right there to speak to this person. So it's a completely different idea, and yet we still use the food as a point of departure.
As a point of departure, but
and
then
hospitality.
The idea of hospitality, exactly,
Yes,
which you then continued into the sleeping project as well,
Yes.
which was even more daring. I mean, can you imagine going to a museum to sleep next to Mingwei? I mean, sort of like eating and having a meal is maybe one level, but you've really then sort of taken it to the next with the sleeping project, which operated along similar lines. You invited, or you did an open call for people to basically spend the night with you.
Separate beds.
Separate beds, very important.
Separate beds, My
that
mom
was very clearly delineated.
Yes, my mom actually didn't like the idea.
Sure, she wasn't.
You're right. It's kind of similar idea, and also based on the hospitality of the person who came to stay with me and share the night with me.
Yeah. And hospitality does play an important role in the history of art by now. I mean, we had the great privilege when I was still in Houston, Texas, and I was running a museum called the Blaff Art Museum at the University of Houston to present a big group show which was called Radical Hospitality in Contemporary Art. And we actually staged the dining project.
Yes.
And so I can speak from first-hand experience from a few years back that the people who participated, audience members who signed up, in our case, it was a lot of students also, really had a quite transformative experience, and it certainly altered their perception of what an artwork is and can be, and how it can live in a museum, because I think that is one of the things that that is so transformative about your work, especially when you bring it into a museum setting, is this kind of, encouraged interaction, this intimacy that you create, which of course, if you think about how we approach art objects in a museum, it is often about this intimate encounter with an object, right? And with a particular work of art. But generally speaking, these objects don't talk back at you. and you in a way, control that encounter because you choose to step in and step away. Whereas once you're engaging with you really make a commitment to a conversation.
Completely.
You're making a commitment to an exchange that can radically transform your expectations and also understanding of what an art experience can be.
Completely. It's almost like doing a tango through the night with the stranger, and using the darkness as a medium, and you just dance psychologically, mentally throughout the night.
And it's really moving. If any of you want to pick up a catalog of any of Mingwei's prior exhibitions, quite a few of them actually contain testimony from people who participated in many of his projects, and we'll talk about a couple of others just in a sec. But it's very moving to read how people experience the work, and how also that changes across different parts of the world and in different cultures. And we talk about introverts and extroverts, but you can sort of also extend that culturally and sort of see how it registers on a different level. I'd love to talk a little bit about the Mending Project. The Mending Project is was for me a very important work of art as I was thinking about, the survey that we're putting together, especially in the context of us having all lived through this pandemic, having encountered, different degrees of isolation, loneliness, illness, and death. And it's very important in terms of my thinking about how art and how a museum, in particular a museum like the De Young, which is a civic museum, it's a museum of the city of San Francisco, can really function also as a place of healing, and how art can become a very active sort of like driver of a healing process and an attempt to overcome trauma collectively and not just individually. And maybe you could talk a little bit about also the genesis of that project, which I think is very important to that as well.
So I'll describe the kind of actual thing when you come to the Dion and what you see, and I'll talk about the genesis. So basically, when you come to the Dion Museum in January 2024, there's a long table with hundreds of spool on the wall, and then there is a mender sitting at the table with needle and thread ready to repair or embellish anything that you bring for them. So, and these are volunteers, right? So sometimes I'll be there, but sometimes we always work with local volunteers. So when I did this in Finland, in the National Art Gallery, we actually had 160 people who wanted to be volunteers to do this. It's really fantastic. So the person will be sitting there and assume that you brought something for this person to repair or embellish. We invite you to sit in front of the mender and share your personal story. Whatever you want to talk about the clothes you brought or your experience, what you did today, who you are, while the mender repaired this clothes. After the process of repairing, there are two things that you could do as the owner of the clothes, is that you could take it back with you when you leave, or you say, I would love to have this piece of clothing as a part of the project for the duration of the time. Because what the mender is going to do is that he will take a thread from the wall, attach it to your piece of clothes that he or she just mended, and then gradually there are more of these clothes, and then you see more of the thread being used from the wall, creating a web, literally a web, of connecting these people who do not know each other, but they're all in the process of realizing this work.
Yeah.
So it's a fairly simple process, and the genesis of this work, it's usually something I don't put it on the wall didactic because it's such a tragic story. I'd rather share it orally. So my husband was in the World Trade Center when the airplane hit. Luckily, he was just a few minutes away when the airplane hit, but he lost 400 of his best friends and colleagues. So I actually didn't know for about 5 hours if he was still alive, because at that time, all the communication was shut down, the building was falling, people were screaming and running. So I went back to our house, took out everything we have that needs to be repaired, and started repairing. Just out of blue, I just started doing that. Maybe it's a way of calming myself, but intuitively, I know something is broken that I just want to repair. Until when I heard the lock turn, and he was standing there covered in ash and blood with 6 people he found on the street, because these were people who were just running away from the falling building. And one, he said this lady was just crying at the corner because she just didn't know what was happening, and she had her shirt burned, half of it burned. So we kept these 6 people with us for 3 weeks, and because the city was all shut down. This happened in 2001, and it took me 9 years to really process this tragedy and transform it into something if I didn't tell you the story like this, you probably won't see the very dark beginning of this. You just see the colorful thread, the generosity of this person repairing. Because for me, it's actually more important to think about how do we move forward as a humanity rather than focusing on these really, really dark events. And it happened, and it was horrible. And yes, and let's move forward. Yeah.
But that's exactly precisely this forward-looking sort of, spirit that the work has, makes it such an important, I think, instance to think about how, it's actually exemplary. I mean, I always say we as curators and as museums, we always look towards artists to learn. Right? We learn from artists, we take our cues from artists. And your practice is so inspiring in terms of thinking about how can we move forward, from a tragedy. And so obviously different types of tragedies, but like that is one aspect of your work that I find so powerful and so rewarding, and it so instills you with hope. And that's something that you don't often and not always find in all artworks or artists' practice, and yours is suffused with that, and it's so beautiful. And I wish we could show you some images. I know it's a little strange to be talking about art without any sort of visual aids. But I hope that Mingwei's descriptions sort of are evoking, some aesthetic articulation in your mind, because that is obviously a very important part of the work as well, and extremely well articulated and thought through, and important in terms of how the work registers and resonates. So yes, if you have, a cloth or any kind of item really that you don't want to discard, that you want to hold on to, but you feel that isn't whole, or that maybe just needs a little embellishing, as you say, because that is also, then save it and come in spring of 24 and sit down with one of our volunteers and see how that, how that experience is and how it can transform both you, the object, and the situation. Let's talk about maybe trying to think about which other project we should talk about to maybe tease out another dimension of how you engaged visitors, because these are all, the three projects that we talked about are ones where there's a very direct one-on-one interaction. So
maybe letter writing project?
Yeah, letter writing project. I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
So letter writing project is one of my very first museum work in 1998, commissioned by the Whitney Museum. Again, simply when you come to the Young Museum, you see 3 lantern-like booths, and there are paper and pencil, and envelope ready for you to write letters of gratitude, forgiveness, and after you wrote these letters, or letters that you didn't have time to write, but here we provide you the chance to write it. After you wrote the letter, you could either leave it unsealed for other people to read, or sealed, and you don't want people to read. And then if you know the receiver's address, please put it on, because we send it out for you. So it's a very simple participatory project that you could, you actually could have done it at home, but then somehow just didn't have the chance to do it. And then when you read other people's very, very intimate letter, hopefully that will also inspire you to write something of similar quality. So that project continues. Today is in Hong Kong and M+. It's been continuing since 1997, 98,
Well, and actually, you're just touching upon, I think, a very important part of your practice, is that these projects are never closed, right? You put them out into the world, and then they appear in different iterations, in different settings. The fundamentals of the project don't change, but of course the context does, the participants do, the times do, and so it's this ongoing sort of like trajectory of a project that doesn't have a finite form or end, which is also really particular to your practice, and which is why, we have projects that start in 2006 and then to the present, and letter writing project is one of them.
Yes.
But it's also really beautiful to think about, especially in this case, how there are these generations of letters, maybe, that are out in the world, whether they got mailed, whether they didn't, but all these people of different backgrounds and ages that sat down in one of these booths and wrote a letter that maybe was just too hard to write.
Yes.
If you're at home.
Yeah. I
And
think so
whatever
too.
motivated you that day to write that letter, whether it's to a lost friend, whether it's
Or
to
deceased
a deceased person, or whether it's just a letter that you, to somebody who's still in your orbit, but you just didn't dare to articulate. All these letters are out there, and we will make the effort of sending it if you want us to. But again, as Mingwei says, there's no obligation.
I have a
to do
very
so
funny
whatso-
story to share.
Yeah,
if I
go
may.
ahead.
So a few years ago, I was doing a public presentation at Tate Modern, and then I talked about the letter writing project. So at the end of the presentation, this young woman came up with a boy next to her, and she said, "I participated in your letter writing project when it was at the Whitney." I said, "Oh, wow, I hope that was a pleasant experience for you." And she said, "Well, let me tell you what happened." I thought, the way she said it doesn't sound very good. But so she said, "Do you remember the curator called you and said, there's a letter that this person didn't want to send out?" And suddenly I broke into a sweat because I remember that the curator, Eugenie Tsai, called me and said, "Mingwei, someone just called the curator and called me, Eugenie, that she doesn't want the letter sent out. And have you sent out the letter?" I say, "Of course, I sent it out because that's what I did every night. So all the letters I had the address on, they're out." So basically what happened was that this young woman, she told me she was breaking up with her boyfriend at the time and was very angry of what he did to her. At the end of the letter, she actually found the courage to forgive him. So she made a turn and just say, "After you did to me what you did to me, but I still love you and I can forgive what you did to me." And, blah, blah, blah. So I sent it out to her, but next day she wanted it back, but it was too late. So the boyfriend received the letter and was so moved by the letter and decided to call her, and they got married. And the child is from this marriage.
No way.
So this child is the letter writing child, standing right there 7 years later.
Oh, how beautiful. You haven't told me that one before.
No, that was quite unusual.
No, that's a rare and beautiful story.
Yes, yeah. So maybe when we do the letter writing project, something quite, I'm sure there are some magical things will happen, but we probably not necessarily would know it.
Yeah, until many years later.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about Guernica in Sand.
Yes, okay, yes.
'Cause that's another major project that we're showing, and also extremely timely, I think. Always timely, but feels even more urgent right now.
Yes. So you all know about Picasso's iconic work, the Guernica, yeah? And right now it's in Reina Sofia. For the longest time it was at MoMA. Anyway, so this work is, for me, I invited Pablo into my work. So hugely inspired by his work and the idea of creating that Guernica. 1937, when the Air Force bombed Guernica and killed so many civilians. So I created a sand version of the Guernica, actually bigger version of the actual painting on the floor. And the idea is that there is one single day, there is a performative part of this work. So we'll decide when that will be. So on that day at 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock midday, I will go down to finish the last portion of that sand painting. So when you come to the museum for the first 2 months, the thing is pretty much, the sand painting is pretty much finished except that little last part. There's some buckets and things like that there. So that gives you an idea that something is going to happen there. So on that day, I would go finish it, and then one person from the audience is invited to walk onto the sand painting while I try to finish that piece. So you could just see the dynamic between these two people who's painstakingly creating the last piece and who's also creating by, or destroying, depends on how you see it, by walking onto the sand painting. When I did it in Guopia's Bao, it was in the atrium, which is very large.
Yeah.
So we probably took 2,000 hours to create that sand painting. But within just a split second, it started to change because the person started walking on it, the first person walk on it, and then leave. The second person walks on it, and then leave. The third, it's like the bombing. It's continuous until the sunset. And basically, it will be fairly changed, right? So to conclude the performative component of this work, myself and 3 other performers will use a broom and just brush the sand to the middle, create a completely different pattern. So you still could see it was Guernica because it was just so big that we couldn't really brush everything off, yeah? You still could see probably remnants of, some remnants. Every time is different because it really depends on how we brush and how people walked. And then we just left it like that for the next duration of the show. So the work is very much about the coexistence of destruction and creation. An Indian traditional dancer saw this work in Guopia's Bao. At the end, she came to me and she said she never, ever seen a work that is about Shiva, that is so powerful. And for her, this is Shiva coming alive in front of her.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, I can't help but think about what's happening in Europe right now, you know? I mean, thinking about the origin of Guernica, the painting, the original painting by Picasso, and why and how it was executed, and, you know, this invasion, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
And now, here we are.
Almost 100 years later.
Witnessing another
the same
invasion,
thing, right?
you know? So, to me, it is just so potent to sort of think about that work and to bring it to, it just feels very urgent also to bring it to our audiences so that we can experience this together and think about sort of this, you know, cyclical, senseless cyclical engagement with war and peace that we have. But it is a hopeful piece. So you know, as all of your work, in the end, it is a hopeful piece because
you're right.
The performance that again sort of like invites audience members in, even though it quasi destroys the piece, it completes the piece at the same time. Because of course, the piece is not about the replication of Guernica itself. It's about what you do with that image and with that idea and what it represents, right? And maybe just to close, it would be lovely to speak about Our Peaceable Kingdom. Because those two works are so codependent, if you will.
So you all know about a very beautiful Quaker painter by the name of Edward Hicks from the 19th century. So he painted, I think, 64 versions of the Peaceable Kingdom. So I took one of this piece, which is in Worcester Museum collection, and invite different artists to look at this piece, what Edward Hicks did, his idea of what peace could be from a Quaker point of view of 19th century, and then reinterpret it in your own way. So at the museum, we'll probably have about 34, 35 versions of the Peaceable Kingdom, and we invited artists from all different parts of the world, from Afghanistan, from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, from Germany, from America. So you could really see that we all have slightly different idea of what peace is, but when you look closely, they're quite similar. It's about harmony among species, among human beings, among nature and an artificial, it just comes out quite differently, but the theme is very similar, and started from Edward Hicks to someone who lives in Hong Kong, or someone who lives in San Francisco. So we are having 3 artists from San Francisco also sort of look at these paintings and also other paintings, to kind of reinvent their version of their peaceful kingdom. Yeah.
And in extension of this invitation that you offer every time you show the work,
Yes.
We have invited a local artist, Chelsea Ryoko Wong, to create her own interpretation and version of Edward Hicks's Our Peaceable Kingdom, and she
invites 2 others.
Exactly, and she in turn invites 2 other artists to do the same. So in this sort of blossoming manner, the piece will grow and grow larger. And what's quite wonderful is that we actually have a version of an Edward Hicks in our collections at the De Young Museum. So we will be showing all of Mingwei's versions and all of his contributors' versions in dialogue with our Edward Hicks, and of course the work by local artists that extends the thinking and the imagining of what peace can be. And maybe this is a nice place to end.
Yeah, and thank you so much for coming. It's Thursday, right? It's a Thursday night?
It is
okay.
Thursday. Yes.
You could be out there having party, watching the airplane. And it was quite shocking for me, too.
I know, I'm glad we're not here in the place right now.
Wow. But apparently it's a San Francisco tradition, right?
Yes, Fleet Week.
Yes, please. Yes. Yes. Beautiful, yeah.
And I think human beings always think because we are human, we are superior. But I find out that the creatures of God that are created are something else. And then when you were talking about peaceable kingdom, I was thinking about that. These animals are totally at peace.
Yes, yeah, and one of the most beautiful part of Edward Hicks, and also many of these painters, is that they often paint children hugging animal, and they live beautifully together, and these so beautiful.
And it's such an important message right now, also as we sort of contemplate the future of humanity in the planetary conditions, and very much part, I think, of many people's thinking around how we have to redefine our relationship, not only to each other, but also to other species, and of course to the planet at large. So Mingwei has a lot to contribute to that.
Thank you.
Well, if there are no other questions, we thank you for coming out.
And please come on Saturday between 12 midday to midnight.
Midnight,
Is it
between
that long?
noon and midnight.
Sorry.
Yes, because that's really why we're here at Grace Cathedral, and that's why you see, I think, in the front already the floor laid out.
Exactly. And at 12 o'clock midday, it will begin with the chorus singing. And at 12 midnight, it will conclude with the organ playing a beautiful piece by Bach. Yes. And in the middle, there will be a performance of 12 hours. Yes. I won't say more, but please come and enjoy.
Please join us. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.